Initiative, where he works on ENACT, which is about enhancing Africa's response to transnational organized crime, as well as the Global Initiative's Organized Crime Index that we'll hear about today, and many other things as well. Before I hand over to Liz, I just wanted to share a couple of reflections on why we actually need to think about measuring organized crime and corruption. If any of you in the room have been working on organized crime and corruption for any period of time, this will probably be the #1 question you get asked by your bosses, whether they be ministers or other officials, whether they be your funders, whether they're international donors or elsewhere. How do we know that what we're trying to do is actually working? How do we know that we're getting a return on investment for what we do and that it's making a difference in terms of the harms we're trying to prevent through this work? It's not an illogical question to ask, actually. It's an important one at a time when, there's always competition for resources and funding spent on anti-corruption or counter-SOC could be spent on other things as well. However, it's kind of a silly question in its own way when you think about what we're actually asking about in terms of corruption or organized crime and trying to put some kind of figure onto that as well. If we can't measure organized crime and corruption, then how do we know that what we're doing is actually effective or not? Or just as important, how do we know if it's backfiring as well? How do we actually measure such a huge range of activities and behaviors that come under both of those massive umbrella terms as well, particularly when they involve by necessity, by definition, activities that are hidden out of sight as well and can't be observed? Liz is actually going to tell us a lot about the whys and wherefores and how and why we think about measuring as well. So I won't go into that, but I'd just like to share 2 reflections from many years of working in this space before handing over to our 2 excellent speakers. And their challenges, I think, for us in the discussion and for them more than anything else. The first one is something that came out of a paper I wrote last year for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy on doing anti-corruption democratically, saying that the approaches to measurement that decision makers typically want to see assume that you can treat anti-corruption or counter-SOC the way you do lots of others, where you establish a baseline and then you can evaluate your interventions against that. But that assumption is based on this idea that somehow there's a set amount of organized crime or corruption that you can establish for a baseline. And the quite silly, but I think quite useful analogy I came up with is it's like assuming that there's a bathtub. So there's a self-contained bathtub filled with organized crime or corruption that you can measure that, and then you're pouring your intervention in like you might do bubble bath or something to clean it. But it's not a bathtub, it's actually an ocean. So it's almost boundless. It's filled with icebergs that melt all the time, adding water, whether you want to or not. And that might be, say, new technologies coming in or illicit financial flows, adding to whatever is in there. You're surrounded by sharks. So elites in countries, whether rich or poor, that are swarming around, leaving a slew of victims in their wake and have every intention of keeping things as they are. And yet we're standing over this ocean holding a bottle of bubble bath as if we're not. And I think one of the biggest challenges coming out of measurement discussions is how to convey something like that to decision makers who still at the end of the day need us to take very seriously understanding whether what we're doing is making a difference or not. Secondly, and I know Liz will touch on this as well, existing measurement approaches have in the past directly contributed to what the academics Alex Cooley and Jason Sharman have called methodological nationalism when it comes to measuring organized crime and corruption. So we think about things in terms of nation states, rather than in terms of the transnational flows. Not all corruption, not all crime is transnational, but an awful lot of it is. And yet we think about things very much at the nation state level. What that does, in a sense, is that masks perhaps where the demand for illicit goods comes from, because if you're measuring where the supply comes from is the problem, you're also perhaps ignoring where the enablers for a lot of these activities are. So a lot of the existing measurements that are used in ranking, in particular, paint a very rosy picture for some of the countries where the highest demand for illicit products are, and where most of the enablers who facilitate this actually sit, while in effect punishing countries that are not, not driving the demand, and where the enablers aren't as well. So when we think about new approaches to measurement as well, can we think about how to manage this methodological nationalism, how to use these discussions to have those conversations as well, thinking about transnational effects, but also these are national effects as well. And national reformers need to think about what happens in their own countries and whether they're effective. So it's not just transnational, and it's not just national, but somewhere in between. And I think on that note, I'm going to hand over to Liz now.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. And I actually do have some slides. I wonder if we could just get the slides up. So as Heather said, I'm coming from the International Anti-Corruption Academy, where I'm running a new global program on measuring corruption. And in my presentation today, I'm going to, if we just go to the next slide. Sorry, next slide, please. And then press return again. So essentially, in my 10 minutes, I'm going to give you some background on why the issue of measuring corruption is important and the background to our program. And then I'm going to talk in much more detail about what we're doing in that program. So on the next slide, please. So essentially, our starting point is that the way you measure concepts really matters. This matters for all sorts of social science and social and political concepts. So how you measure inequality, for example, matters for how you conceive of the problem and then how you design solutions to try to address it. And it's exactly the same with corruption. And I think the best or a good example of that is embodied in this table on the right. I don't know if it's possible to move the screens so that it doesn't obscure the table. But essentially what we've got in that table on the right is the top 10s from 2 different indicators of corruption. So on the very right, we've got the top 10 cleanest countries on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. So that's a measure of public sector corruption. On the left of the table, we've got the top 10 dirtiest countries on the Financial Secrecy Index. And that's an indicator that measures how much a country facilitates secrecy around financial flows, which can be related to tax evasion, but also to money laundering, the proceeds of corruption. And that's the top 10 dirtiest countries. So the interesting thing is that if you look at all those countries highlighted in yellow, they come out as the top 10 in the top 10 cleanest on one measure and the top 10 dirtiest on another. The point is not to say that one of these indices is better than another, but that it really matters how you measure things. And it matters also because many, many different organizations and stakeholders make decisions on the basis of these indicators. So they then have a material and reputational impact on countries. It can affect how much investment a country gets, how much aid it gets, and therefore has a much deeper impact on economic development and even perhaps on the ability to tackle corruption. At the same time, if you do measurement well, then it can actually be used to incentivize and motivate reform. So because countries care about these reputational effects, if they see that they can do certain things to improve their score, then that can help to incentivize reform. And if you get the measure right and it's accurate and it has clear guidance on how to improve, then you can actually have a really beneficial effect on the actual anti-corruption agenda. Next slide, please. So, of course, lots of people have tried to measure corruption before, and there are many different types of indicators out there. None of them is perfect and no measure will be. But there are a number of problems with the existing approaches. Firstly, there's a lot of reliance on subjective data. So a lot of reliance on perceptions in particular. And this leads to all sorts of bias. They're also generally oversimplistic. So a lot of aggregate indicators provide one score for one country, and that ignores what we know is the complexity of corruption, but also how it varies among sectors and geographies. They're also not very good at tracking change over time. And this is something where we hear from governments that they're really keen to be able to assess whether they are improving things and changing things over time. But many of the existing approaches are not very useful for monitoring that progress. And finally, they're often built on a quite narrow understanding of corruption and corruption control, and in particular focus largely on petty corruption and bureaucratic corruption. Now, that might be the thing that's easiest to measure. So I think it's explainable why we tend to focus on that, but it might not be the thing that is most damaging. So often grand corruption is much more damaging, but it's harder to measure, and we risk overlooking it if we can't measure it. Next slide, please. There are lots of reasons why this problem is really difficult and why measuring corruption is difficult. As Heather said, it's by nature a secretive activity. There's very little consensus on the definition of corruption, and that means that particularly when we're using subjective data, we don't even know if we're really asking people about the same thing or they're envisaging the same thing. We do now have more proxy measures that are based on more objective data, but that's often difficult to do across the board because few governments are collecting data that's of sufficiently high quality to be able to use those indicators. And of course, corruption is very politically sensitive, so any reporting of the measures is also subject to potential distortions and misinterpretation. Next slide, please. There's been growing interest at the intergovernmental level in a new approach. Starting in 2017, when Italy was the president of the G7, they highlighted the need to develop new corruption indicators. The Conference of States Parties of UNTOC then took this on with a resolution in 2019. In 2020, the G20 under Saudi Arabia's presidency held an academic roundtable on anti-corruption, which again identified measurement as a key priority. Italy took that on when it was president of the G20 the following year, publishing a compendium on measurement of corruption. And so our program at IACA is really building on all of that growing demand for new measures and saying, well, okay, let's invest some resource and time and expertise in trying to respond to that. Next slide, please. So our new program then is aimed to design new measures very much in consultation with practitioners from different countries and from different sectors, governments, private sector, civil society, media, international organizations. We aim for it to be smarter than current indices in terms of being able to contextualize corruption and efforts to combat corruption. And we aim for it to be more actionable for practitioners who are tackling corruption in their own countries, and not based on a one-size-fits-all approach to tackling corruption. Next slide, please. Overall, the core principles of the program are that measurement should be scientifically robust, but it should also be practically useful, and it should be truly global in its approach. And so those principles then feed into our work plan for the next few years. Next slide, please. In year one, we've got two main work streams. The first is that multi-stakeholder consultation. And here the aim is to find out who's actually using indicators of corruption. Are they finding them useful? And if not, what would they want? If they had a wish list for improved corruption indicators, what would be on it? We're consulting with all those different sectors that I mentioned, and we're also conducting in-depth research in 4 countries, Italy, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. And the aim of that and the overall objective at the end of the year is to have a much more nuanced understanding of the use cases for corruption indicators. The second work stream then is on the methodological innovation side. Here we are looking at existing measures and trying to identify the gaps. What is currently not very well measured by those existing measures? And we identify areas, and then we're convening expert workshops to try to make progress and advance the debate in those areas. So we've already had our first workshop, which was on measuring integrity, so taking a more positive approach towards understanding what makes an organization or a country resilient to corruption. The next workshop is on illicit financial flows, and particularly those illicit financial flows related to grand corruption. There'll be a workshop on state capture early next year, and then the fourth one is yet to be determined depending on the results of our mapping. The output of that is a state-of-the-art report on methods for measuring corruption. Next slide, please. Moving on then and looking ahead, in the following years of the programme, our aim is to move towards developing a methodology and tools for new measurement methods. So first of all, we'll have a conference held jointly with UNODC. UNODC is also working on measuring corruption and has a mandate to address that 2019 resolution. So we're working very closely with them, and we'll have a joint conference to present the outputs of our initial work in September next year. That will provide an opportunity to get feedback from countries on what we're doing, what they think is working and what's not. And we'll use that to develop our methodology, to pilot a measurement tool initially in 4 countries, and then on the basis of, again, feedback and refinement, we'll roll that out to 20 countries in year 4. Finally, on the next slide, please. We'd like to invite you all to get in touch and to partner with us in various ways. So one of our aims here is very much to get the debate going and the discussion going on measurement of corruption. We know that there are lots of practitioners in different countries and different sectors who are working on this issue and facing these problems that Heather mentioned of trying to quantify corruption, trying to quantify progress, and being able to tell the minister what you've achieved or not. So do get in touch. We've got a number of ways of getting in touch here. We have an email address, a Twitter account, and we've also launched a new podcast where we'll be keeping you up to date with what we're doing in terms of all of the work streams. We can also provide a briefing for you, and we'll just be interested to hear from all of you as part of our consultation process.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that. Going to leave it questions till after, because you don't take everything together, so there'll be time to do that. I think we're going to go over to Katrina, who is online, who's going to talk to us about measuring organized crime. Thank you. Kasia, just in case, I think Darren is going to, we're keeping an eye on an 8-minute warning followed by a 2.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Before I begin, could you please let me know if you can hear me well? There were some issues before.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm pleased to be presenting today the first ever Global Organized Crime Index. In my presentation, I will do a brief overview of our methodology and the tool structure, and then I will briefly present 2 of the main findings of the report, along with briefly mentioning what lies ahead for the Global Organized Crime Index. Now, first, let me begin by saying that given the clandestine nature of organized crime, it is more important to see past the numbers and delve into the complex environments in which organized crime thrives. So above all, our main goal is not to point fingers, but for the index to serve as a catalyst for a constructive dialogue on the subject. And then hopefully this will contribute to an improved policymaking and prioritization. Additionally, we hope that the value of the tool will only grow over time, so that in future stakeholders will be able to assess trends in both criminality and in resilience. Now, a brief look at the structure of the index. First, modeling an index is not an easy feat by a long shot. The inherently clandestine nature of organized crime, with its ever-changing forms and environments, carry the risk of the index becoming an overly complex tool. At the same time, however, oversimplifying it would risk sacrificing the kind of nuanced analysis that are needed to inform stakeholders of the conditions within their countries. In turn, that we see that this might obstruct the development of effective organized crime strategies. So we have tried to not overcomplicate the tool, but also provide a thorough picture of organized crime in different contexts by measuring both criminality and resilience. And so the 2021 iteration of the Global Index is based on 3 key elements. First, we have the scope, scale, and impact of specific criminal markets, which are shown here. Then we have the structure and influence of 4 criminal actor types, and then the existence and capacity of countries to be resilient to organized crime measured across 12 what we call resilience building blocks. Now, as an expert-led assessment for each of the 193 countries that the index covers, 2 overall scores are calculated, one for criminality, and then the other for resilience. The criminality component consists of 2 subcomponents, which are criminal markets and criminal actors. All indicators in the index are measured on a scale of 1 to 10, as you can see here on the left-hand side. For the criminality component, a score of 1 represents the best possible case where the illicit market or criminal actor type does not exist, and a score of 10 represents the worst possible case where the illicit market or criminal actor type is extremely pervasive in nature and has a negative influence on all parts of, or pretty much all parts of society and or state structures. When determining the criminal market score, experts are asked to consider the monetary impact of the market, but also the non-monetary one, which is the geographic concentration of the market, the number of people that are involved in the market or impacted by it, how much violence is there, how scarce is the commodity that is being traded, the environmental impact of the market, and so on. In a similar fashion, when determining the score for criminal actors, experts are asked to consider the organizational capacity and the sophistication of different criminal actor types, as well as their overall influence on society and state structures. Now, whereas the criminality score allows users to identify problems as well as their scale, the resilience score, on the other hand, is an indicator of the kinds and effectiveness of measures that countries have in place to achieve solution to organized crime. Importantly, the ultimate purpose of our index is to help identify and implement practical measures to successfully combat organized crime. So the importance of the resilience aspect cannot be emphasized enough. Now, I'm saying this because a lot of attention tends to focus on criminality for obvious reasons. And so this is an appeal to just not overlook resilience, as it is a critical aspect of the global organized crime index. And by contrast to criminality, for the 12 resilience indicators, that 1 to 10 scale is flipped. So a score of 1 represents the worst possible scenario. In other words, the resilience measure does not exist. And a score of 10 represents the best possible case where the resilience measure not only exists, it is also extremely effective and could account for emerging threats. For that resilience component, experts are asked to assess 2 key elements. First, does the resilience measure or framework exist? And secondly, is the measure effective in combating organized crime? Importantly, however, one caveat here is that we provide guidelines to experts, to scorers, to not penalize a country for not having, for example, a law on IUU fishing if the country is landlocked, for example, or IUU fishing is not a threat in that environment. Another qualifier, very important, that needs to be mentioned is that it is not enough for a resilience measure to exist and be effective. In this sense, we also look at how is that resilience measure implemented and whether it meets international human rights standards. The process of index development is an iterative process, as you can see here, consisting of a number of different rounds, including open source research that is used to create preliminary profiles for all 193 countries that are included in the index. And then we have 2 independent rounds of scoring, followed by what we call expert group meetings and internal calibration carried out with the help of GI-TOC observatories. In the end, more than 5,000 indicators were scored, as you can see, with the process relying on more than 350 experts, which underscores the collective effort it took to develop a product that is comprehensive, that is accurate, and truly global in scale. Now, on to the main findings really quickly. One of the main findings is that nearly 80% of the world's population live in conditions where criminality is pervasive and resilience is not sufficient. We use this vulnerability matrix that you see on the screen here to show this. Now, the x-axis represents criminality, and the y-axis represents resilience, with the midway points being 5.5. Starting from this lower left quadrant, we have the low criminality, low resilience, and right next to it is the high criminality and low resilience quadrant, where the countries in the most dire situation fall into. These two taken together, overall, we have that 79.4% of the global population live in countries with low resilience. On the top left corner here, we have the low criminality, high resilience quadrant, and this is where countries would want to be. And on the right, this small quadrant here, this is high criminality and high resilience category. Very counterintuitive, but it's another matter. Taken together, this quadrant and the one below makes up a total of 79.2% of the global population who live in high criminality environments. Another key issue that relates to resilience is conflict and instability. Our data has shown that conflict and instability was not only linked to criminality, where the highest scoring countries were those that were experiencing fragility, but also to resilience, where a strong negative correlation was found between the fragile states index and the resilience scores from our index. It might be the case that countries in conflict settings, state attention is diverted to war efforts, which inevitably leaves social, economic, and security institutions weakened. And in a similar fashion, in conflict setting, when there is a dispute over territory or resources, territorial control and social cohesion are likely to be diminished. And so all of these circumstances can lead to an overall decline in resilience to organized crime. And lastly, I'm going to briefly touch upon the feedback that we've received and outline the next steps for the index. Now, since launch, the index has been featured in more than 800 articles across a variety of media outlets with overwhelmingly positive feedback. Alongside with that, the GI has also received positive feedback from a range of other stakeholders at all levels, including national, regional, and international bodies, for which we are very grateful. The index, not least of all, has gotten a lot of positive feedback from academia, which in itself is very reassuring, highlighting the usefulness of the index and the intention on part of academia to use it as a tool, as a teaching resource at the university level. And to continue building upon the success of the global index, we have started our index blog series, as well as our very own podcast, which is available on the GI-TOC's website, covering different themes and regions. And lastly, we are now well into the first stages of developing the 2023 tool, which is going to be launched towards the end of September of next year, so 2023. At this point, country profiles have been updated, and now we're coming towards the end of round one expert scoring. And to make it so that the index provides an even more thorough picture, a more detailed snapshot of organized crime environments, the 2023 index will include 5 new criminal markets. These are cyber-dependent crimes, financial crimes, trade in counterfeit goods, illicit trade in excise goods, extortion and protection racketeering, as well as an additional criminal actor type, which is private sector actors. And I'm going to leave it at that and back to Heather. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. We're going to go to the room first and look for 2 or 3 questions to start before going to the online as well. If we have time, we've got about just over 10 minutes here. If you raise your hand, if you could let us know your name and organization, and please let us know who the question is for and keep it short to keep it fair. So, producer.
Thank you, Heather. I'm Tariq Khosa, Director of Center for Governance Research, a civil society organization. And from our platform, we launched a national initiative against transnational organized crime. And we see a strong nexus between corruption and organized crime, and that's how we study it. But I've been a practitioner also as being head of the federal police. So you have posed the key question is the measurement. How do you make a difference? How do you measure? Well, one is political will. That is state capture, has been pointed out. And it's not only politicians, but it is those who fund them. Legislation is important. Another thing is institutional integrity and professionalism. I think this is independence of judiciary, investigators, prosecutors, and judges. That is no holy cows. That is the basic issue. So if you want to judge, if you are making a difference, are you capturing the elite? Are you going after the ruling party in power? And have you got institutional independence and integrity to go for this? This is the way to measure how. Secondly, I think, Elizabeth, you have raised very important issue. Your institution provides international best practice, and we would like that across the states and professionals and civil society organization, there should be a very strong linkage with your organization where these debates take place in the context of reputation reform and influence. We very much like to promote that. Finally, the Global Index on Organized Crime, it is an excellent start, at least a measurement, indicators, some surveys, opinions of experts are being taken, and it is going to improve further. I'm also a member of the Global Initiative Network, as Heather, you are. So we closely monitor that, and we think that this is one yardstick, one indicator, one international best practice, which eventually, like the Transparency International, determines corruption from different angles. But this GI is focused on professional aspects of how to measure this extent of crime in different areas and in different categories and milieus. So all 3 excellent presentations. And I think we look forward to some of the conclusions and partnership that needs to be developed between the states and the civil society to forge a battle against corruption and organized crime. Thank you for this very important side event.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to another question here in the room. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not the question. I'm Ugis Vekic, I'm Senior Advisor at Global Initiative, and just thank you for this. So what I wanted to say that in addition to Organized Crime Index, because we are dealing with organized crime, we are also dealing with corruption. And the methods that we are using dealing with corruption is political economy analysis, which we carried out and came up with the concept of organized corruption, which is similar to state capture, high corruption, etc., but it's more based on qualitative research. But what I wanted to say about measuring in particular corruption. And that is quite true, Elizabeth, what you said. Many are, perception-based or even the organized crime index is very much expert-based. So despite the fact that it has a very solid foundations, it is still opinion-based. But we have in corruption arena a great opportunity to measure government resilience. Many governments today have strategies, right? Anti-corruption strategy, it's ad hoc, very popular, everybody has it. Usually they have some indicators, usually they have some measures. And what we are doing, at least in Southeast Europe, is measuring or monitoring, assessing pledges that government has made on the basis of their strategies. And these strategies, believe me, cross-culturally are very, very similar. This is a good dimension to look at in future. And finally, we are organizing this week actually in Athens for Southeast Europe, teaching organized crime and corruption courses for the university professors, in which we will present organized crime index and different measures of corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give one more question, and it needs to be short and a question, if that's okay. But please listen. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. My name is Matthias Futter from the UNTOC Coalition. I would be interested in hearing from both the speakers how you anticipate you could bring your research, your assessments into the conventions, into the UNTOC and UNTOC sphere. We have the review mechanisms. Sometimes these are very strong reviews, especially when civil society is involved. Sometimes the findings are very, very optimistic. How do you anticipate you can bring in your findings so that they inform the discussions and ideally also the reviews on the national level that take place under the two conventions? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to do it backwards and go to Kasia. So just say 2 minutes max to respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Our view is that we need to work closely with civil society. As you might know, one of the 12 resilience building blocks measures the environment in which civil society and media are able to operate in countries. And for us, it is critical to involve that entire sector into the discussion around countering organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks, Matthias, for your question. I'll take that one first. So in a very practical way, we're organising a conference jointly with UNODC next September, which will provide an opportunity for us to say what we've been doing in the first year. So give the those two outputs, the use cases and the state of the art report, and we'll be inviting countries to feedback on that. And we've timed that to be just before the implementation review group. So all of the UNCAC delegations will be here. So that will be a practical way in which we'll feed in. We also, the findings coming out of our expert workshops, we hope to match those up against the UNCAC review mechanism where they are, fitting in and relevant, so that we can see how they do relate to the findings. But we're really keen to bring in that rich qualitative evidence that is coming actually through the review mechanism. So definitely keen to do that. And just a couple of other comments on the other two interventions. Thank you very much. To yours on national anti-corruption strategies, I think it's an excellent point. We do have so many countries now producing anti-corruption strategies that's a key potential source of information. From some earlier work that I've done, unfortunately, very few countries are monitoring them and evaluating progress. So it's definitely something that could be done, and it's not being done at the moment. And then to the first intervention, I guess actually something that really strikes me from hearing the conversation so far is how in this setting, with lots of people who are interested in organised crime, suddenly people talk about that high level corruption and state capture, which actually in my corruption world, people don't talk about so much in the measurement sphere. They do in the policy sphere, but not in the measurement sphere. So it's just really nice to have that interaction, I think. And thanks again to GI for suggesting we do this joint event. It's good to get that dialogue going.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time and the fact that there are other side events going on, so we will wrap up on time, and my apologies to those online. We'll look at the questions and comments, and we'll encourage Liz and Kostya to respond where possible afterwards. A couple of closing thoughts from me. I mean, I was really struck when, Kostya, when you were talking about the importance of conflict and fragility coming through in the findings in the index. And I think right now we're really seeing every day and have been for a long time, but we're acknowledging, I would say now with what's going on in Europe, the impact of not seeing organized crime, illicit finance, and transnational corruption in particular as strategic threats. So seeing them as law enforcement problems, law and order, judiciary, public administration, and so on, but actually not seeing them as strategic threats. And I would really encourage those working on measurement to try to reach out to those communities, as well as the sort of typical practitioners that we work with when we're talking about corruption in particular, but also organized crime. It's possible to do that without becoming too militarized, but it's really clear that those are important to have. Second one, and this probably won't be a surprise to Liz, but I would really encourage both Liz's team and Kostya and GI really thinking about communications on the findings, but also users, so practitioners in the room who will use and develop your own measurements as well, because perceptions may be a really poor way to measure organized crime and corruption for all sorts of reasons, but they are shaped by measurements of organized crime and corruption as well. One of the biggest, saddest ironies is that really good, effective interventions that are being discussed in an open and transparent way can actually create a perception that the problem is getting worse, at least in the short and medium term. If you get to the long term, that might be fine, but in the meantime, there will be populists and extremists who are also paying attention and using those messages, and there will be business and investors also paying attention. So thinking about communicating progress as well as just the numbers, those caveats for users that are being so helpfully included, I think is really important there. And just a last point on political will. It's absolutely fundamental to there's the measurement issue, and then there's the what happens next. And actually on the SACE side, we've been collaborating with Global Initiative and with Liz and other research as well. But political will is one of the core things that we're looking at, and it would be great to be able to continue the conversations on collaboration around that in terms of thinking about actually strategies for taking these measurements and thinking about how they can be used either to bolster and support genuine political will, or how to nudge or push hard for where it might not exist as well. And measurements can be extremely important tools for that sort of activity as well, bearing in mind what I said at the beginning about caveats and all of that. So on that, thank you very much to Global Initiative for organizing that, and for such incredible numbers here in the room and online as well. And thank you to Liz and Kostya for giving us so much to think about. So thank you very much, everyone.